In the spring, when the snow finally melted in Southport, the city's Public Works Department began preparing the quarry for the summer season. The place was an old reservoir outside the city limits, frequented by fishermen, teenagers, and vacationers. There was no beauty to it: peeling railings, cracks in the concrete slabs, thickets of reeds along the edges. But it was there, in early April, that a crew of workers was sent to clear away trash, cut the dry grass, and check if the banks had collapsed after the winter. The workers followed their instructions, collecting trash in bags, raking up branches. Everything was going smoothly until one of them, a man named Grigory, a local who had worked here for years, noticed a strange bag. Gray, thick, tied in several knots, it was stuck in a crevice between the rocks right at the water's edge. At first, Grigory thought nothing of it. Bags like that were always plentiful here, especially after the spring floods. He simply pried it with his shovel, intending to toss it into the wheelbarrow, but the bag turned out to be unexpectedly heavy. Not trash, not bottles. Inside was something dense, weighty. Curiosity won out. They unwrapped the bag. Inside were neatly folded items: a dark hoodie, a pair of sneakers, and an old feature phone without a battery. Everything was soaked but clean, with no traces of dirt, as if someone had kept them in a dry place and only recently thrown them away. The items were folded not like trash, but like something a person wanted to save. What was also surprising was the absence of anything personal. No keys, no documents, not even a store receipt. Only clothes, a phone, and a small, crumpled piece of paper. When the police arrived on the scene, the area was immediately cordoned off. Investigators worked quietly, methodically. One documented the location of the find with a camera. Another checked the bank. A third examined the grass around it. The bag was carefully transferred to a separate container. Even at first glance, it was clear the items had been here for a long time. The fabric was faded, but had kept its shape. The sneakers were old, worn, but the laces were tied, as if the person had taken them off himself. The phone was an old model from the late 2000s. The paint on the back cover had worn off, and the body was slightly warped, as if from moisture. But the most interesting part was inside. When a forensics expert opened the casing, he found a tiny slip of paper between the microchips. The paper had yellowed, the ink had bled, but the words were still legible. Stage 3, 0247. Just 2 lines, but they immediately put the detectives on high alert. The phrase seemed familiar, as if it had appeared in some old report. One of the officers recalled, several years ago, in the Missing Persons Archive, there was the case of a teenager named Alexei Sidorov. Back then, there was also mention of some stages, some strange posts on forums. At the time, it had all been written off as fiction, a teenage game, and not given much importance. But the coincidence with the note they found forced everyone to reconsider that story. The phone's serial number quickly confirmed it. The found device belonged to that same Sidorov. He had been reported missing in October 2020. According to his parents, he left home in the evening saying he was meeting friends. His phone went off around 9. No one saw him again. The search lasted for months but yielded no results. It was concluded that he might have run away, possibly voluntarily. Now, that theory collapsed. Everything indicated that the items had been at the quarry for at least a year. The clothes matched in size and brand, and the found phrase, Stage 3, corresponded with the content of messages Alexei had written in a private online chat the day before he disappeared. Investigators retrieved the chat archives and found confirmation. It mentioned a game in which participants completed tasks at night, documented the results, and sent photos to a shared channel. The initial analysis showed that the bag had been left by hand, no drag marks, no footprints nearby. This meant someone brought it here later. Likely, a person who wanted the find to be noticed, but not immediately. It looked like a signal, a way to bring attention back to the old case. The police canvassed the area, questioning local fishermen and watchmen. No one had seen anything suspicious. Only one man, living a kilometer from the quarry, remembered hearing the sound of a car late one night a couple of weeks ago. He thought it was teenagers and paid no mind. In the missing persons department, they already understood. A new chapter of the old investigation had begun. The found bag was the first real physical lead in 3 years. Not a message on the internet, not rumors, but concrete items that could be studied, analyzed, and compared. The investigation decided to reopen the Sidorov case. For the parents, this news was a blow, but also a faint hope. They came to the scene and recognized the clothes. It all belonged to Alexei, no doubt. Forensics took the find to the lab to check for DNA, while investigators began checking the digital footprints of old chats. There were no official conclusions yet, but rumors immediately started to spread through the city. Some said someone had planted the items to renew interest in the case. Others, that a person connected to the game was returning. Thus, an ordinary bag on the bank of a quarry became the start of an investigation that would change the perception of how far a harmless internet pastime could go. Now the investigation had not just a name, but a concrete piece of evidence, and a starting point to search for those who were behind it all. Alexei Sidorov was born and raised in Southport, a small seaside town where everyone knows each other, and news spreads faster than the local newspaper can print it. An ordinary family, his father a mechanic, his mother a pharmacist. A house on the outskirts, the kind where a yellow light glows on the porch in the evening, and an old bicycle stands under the awning year-round. Alexei attended the local school, without problems and without any particular achievements. Teachers said he was quiet, diligent, and non-confrontational. Not a leader, not a rebel. School questionnaires described him simply introverted but friendly. He kept his distance from classmates, not because he was strange, but because he just didn't fit into the noisy crowds. He was into computers, spent hours on the internet, and collected old electronics. According to his mother, it was there, online, that he felt more confident than among people. He had several online friends with whom he communicated more often than with those who lived across the street. And it was this dependence on virtual communication that eventually became the key detail that defined the subsequent events. At home, he rarely argued. His mother said he was calm as water. He hardly ever raised his voice, but knew how to stand his ground. Sometimes he might go for a walk without warning, but he always came back on time. He gave no cause for alarm, until one evening that changed. According to the official version, it all happened in late October. It was already dark when Alexei got ready to go out. His mother recalled that he looked focused but calm. He said he was meeting friends, possibly going for a photo shoot. He had recently developed a habit of taking an old digital camera with him. She didn't press him for details, just wished him a good night. The last time she saw him was around 8 in the evening. A couple of hours later, she noticed her son's phone wasn't answering. At the time, it didn't seem strange. Cell service in the area was often spotty. Only by midnight did her anxiety turn to panic. The next day, the family went to the police. In her statement, the mother wrote, "He went for a walk and didn't come back." This became the starting point of the official investigation. But within a few days, the first discrepancy appeared in the investigation. According to his statement, Alexei had said he was going to a friend's house, a certain Artyom. A check revealed that Artyom had been at home with his family that evening, and no one had come to visit him. Moreover, his phone was pinging in another part of the city at that time. The story about the meeting fell apart. The police began to work through his social media contacts. The chats revealed that in recent weeks, Alexei had been communicating with members of a private online community where they discussed so-called trials. These were tasks, mostly strange, seemingly harmless ones. Walk down a street at night, photograph an abandoned building, do something that required courage. There was no obvious threat, but his messages contained a recurring phrase, Stage 3, the same one later found on the note in the bag. Thus, the initial version of a simple walk turned out to be a fiction. He wasn't going to a friend's house or on a photo shoot. The last signal from his phone was recorded in an industrial zone near an old warehouse, a 10-minute drive from the quarry. That was his last digital footprint. Now, the investigation had to find out where he was really heading and who knew about his route. And this was the first serious contradiction in a case that had, until then, seemed like a simple disappearance. After the police identified the owner of the found items, investigators returned to the very beginning, the Sidorov family home. It was there, in his room, that they could understand what had been happening in the last days before his disappearance. The room looked neat, almost too neat. On the desk was a tidy stack of notebooks, a couple of books, a computer, and old speakers. His clothes were folded, the bed was made. No signs of a struggle, disarray, or a hasty departure. Everything indicated that Alexei had left consciously. But the longer they examined the room, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if it were frozen in time, as if its owner had just stepped out for a minute. On a shelf were small items, untouched since the fall. A mug with a dried tea stain, a withered movie ticket, a couple of old flash drives. Everything looked ordinary, except for one thing. On the desk was a laptop. The screen was slightly ajar, as if it had been shut down in a hurry, but not completely. When an expert turned on the device, the system booted up without a password. This was strange. Alexei always protected his data. The desktop had minimal icons, only standard programs. But among them, they noticed one shortcut with a cryptic name, room.exe. No description, no icon, just a gray square. The folder containing the file had been created 3 days before the disappearance. The investigator launched the program. A dark screen with white text appeared. Access granted. Stage 3 active. No interface, no menu, just this inscription and a sound. A quiet, barely audible background noise, like breathing or a distant fan. After a few seconds, the screen went dark. Cybersecurity specialists later determined that this was not a virus or a standard application. The program connected to an encrypted server with a non-standard IP, using protocols typical of the dark web. At that stage, it seemed like just a strange find, but later it became the key to understanding where Alexei had disappeared. An examination of the browser history raised even more questions. He had visited pages not indexed by regular search engines. There, they discussed stages, observers, and quiet rooms. It all sounded like part of some game, but without the usual attributes. No avatars, no likes, no comments. Just a series of messages, dates, and coordinates. Investigators found several such coordinates, and they all pointed to real abandoned places in the city's vicinity: an old warehouse, a lakeshore, an unfinished bridge. At first, they thought it was a coincidence, but one of the posts read, "Third stage, one must remain." After that, it became clear. This was not a harmless game. The system was a closed loop, accessible only to a few. To get in, you needed an invitation, a unique code. In Alexei's correspondence, they found such a code, sent from a user with the nickname Curator47. His account had existed for only a few days and disappeared immediately after Alexei activated the link. The police turned to cybercrime specialists for help. They began tracking the network, analyzing encryption and mirror sites. But the main discovery was yet to come. The server to which the program connected was physically located not in Russia, but on a server farm in Eastern Europe. This completely changed the direction of the investigation. Now it was not about a simple disappearance of a teenager or a domestic conflict. Everything pointed to the fact that Alexei had become part of something larger, a closed digital community where participants performed dangerous tasks, and communication between them was conducted through encrypted channels. From that moment on, the investigation definitively moved beyond the scope of a typical criminal case. The police were no longer searching for a person in physical space. Now, they were trying to find a trace in the digital one. And that was where the real story began. The story of the quiet room. When the cybersecurity specialists got Alexei's laptop, the first thing they did was try to break the protection of the quiet room. The program turned out to be not just encrypted, but deliberately designed so that any unauthorized access would erase all traces of activity. 3 attempts, and everything disappears. This was no amateur development. The system looked professional. Multiple layers of encryption, hidden communication channels, dynamic addresses. Someone really did not want anyone looking in. The investigators understood. Time was short. As long as the device was connected, its digital masters could have already noticed the activity and tried to destroy the data remotely. So, in the lab, they urgently created a copy of the hard drive and worked only with it. It took 2 days to bypass the security and gain access to the internal files. When the system finally opened, a dark page with a simple menu appeared on the screen. No pictures, no links. Just a list of dozens of messages, sorted by date and stage. From the very beginning, it was clear. This was not a forum, a chat, or a blog. Each message looked like a report. Short, laconic phrases, devoid of emotion. For example, Stage 1, Forest, 22:30, completed. Or Stage 2, Water, 2 failed. Such entries went on for weeks, sometimes without a date, sometimes with coordinates. Under each message was the participant's name, but they were all encrypted under digital pseudonyms: L3, Wanderer, Moth, Curator 47. The very name, The Quiet Room, now took on a different meaning. Apparently, it was a private platform where a group of people performed tasks, each one becoming progressively riskier. All stages took place at night and required mandatory confirmation, a photo, coordinates, sometimes short audio files. The content of the messages gave the impression that someone was managing the process. And that someone was Curator 47, the same person who sent Alexei the entry code. During the analysis, specialists recovered part of the correspondence. Among the encrypted files, they found one particularly noteworthy entry. It was created on the night of Alexei's disappearance, October 27th at 02:46, almost simultaneously with the time on the slip of paper found in the bag. The message read, "Stage 3 completed. 1 did not return. Protocol followed." This became a turning point. The phrase, "1 did not return," sounded not like a random turn of phrase, but like a recorded event. After that, the investigators no longer had any doubt. The game was not a game. It was a structure with clear rules, and someone was controlling every action of the participants. The next stage of the investigation required precision. The experts began a technical analysis of the data. They extracted metadata from the files and started looking for digital footprints, IP addresses, connection times, transmission routes. Most of the addresses led through proxies and virtual private networks. It all looked as if the creator of The Room had prepared in advance for being pursued. But there was one mistake. In one of the logs, system journals automatically created with each login, a direct address was recorded. This happened on the night Alexei was online. According to the data, the user with the nickname Curator47 had connected directly, not through an anonymizer. His IP address led to a regular residential building, a high-rise on the outskirts of Southport. When the address was checked, everything matched. It was an apartment registered to Artyom Kovasky, the very same friend Alexei claimed he was going to see on the day he disappeared. This fact changed the course of the investigation. Now the police had not an abstract curator from the internet, but a real person with a specific address. For the first time, the investigation began to take shape. Ahead lay an interrogation, a search, and an examination of all devices associated with Artyom. It was from this moment that the case ceased to be a story about a digital mystery. It became a story about people who brought a virtual game into real life. When the specialists confirmed the IP address match, a silence fell over the department. No one expected that the digital trail leading to the quiet room would lead not to a basement, not to an anonymous data center, but to an ordinary two-room apartment on the outskirts of Southport. The address was 14 Centralnaya Street, apartment 26. A panel building, a shabby entrance, familiar to everyone in this city. But the main thing was not even that. The owner of the apartment was listed as Lilia Morozova, 17 years old, a student at the same school Alexei Sidorov attended. A classmate. The same one he sat next to in biology class. When the investigators found out who was behind the IP, the reaction was unanimous. That's impossible. It all seemed too adult, too thought out to have come from a schoolgirl. A program with security that a bank could envy isn't created during breaks between classes. But the database was not mistaken. The connection time matched to the second, and the device's digital fingerprint confirmed the laptop's ownership. And all this from a room with posters on the walls and textbooks on the desk. The detectives arrived that same day. Lilia opened the door herself, without fear, without panic. She was wearing home clothes, her hair was tied back, and in her hand was a mug of cold tea. The apartment smelled of vanilla and nail polish. At first glance, an ordinary girl, immersed in her own world. A music program was open on her laptop screen, and a notebook with class notes lay on the table. No technology that would raise suspicion. It looked as if she were just doing her homework. The first conversation was calm. She was asked to come to the station for questioning. She didn't object, even joked that it must be some kind of mistake. The report later noted, behaved confidently, calm, emotionally reserved. The investigator started with the standard questions: name, age, place of study, social circle. Everything went by the book until one word was spoken: the room. At that moment, Lilia visibly tensed. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "It's just a game," she said. "We did tasks, made videos, exchanged ideas. It was our way of having fun." Her tone was even, but too rehearsed. It seemed she had prepared this version in advance. The investigator decided to test her reaction. He took out a printout of the logs, a list of connections, timestamps, digital signatures. He placed it on the table in front of her. "You logged into the server on October 27th at 02:46. That coincides with the time of Alexei's disappearance. Can you explain that?" Lilia didn't blink. "No. Maybe someone used my Wi-Fi or my laptop. My friends use it often." But her story fell apart within minutes. On her laptop, seized during the search, they found the very file, room.exe. It was in a hidden folder, accessible only through the command line. The file had been activated 3 times, the last time on the same night Alexei stopped communicating. While experts were copying the drive, analysts reviewed the correspondence in the encrypted chats. There was activity from her profile, and not just comments or discussions, but commands. "Watch the time. Don't bother him. The stage has begun." These short messages came from the user Curator47, and it was under this nickname that Alexei had received the invitation to enter the quiet room. When she was shown these lines, she visibly changed. She stopped making eye contact, spoke more quietly. "He wanted to participate himself," she said. "I didn't force anyone. Everyone knew what they were getting into." It sounded both like an excuse and a confession. But the most important part was not in her words, but in the details. Experts noticed that messages from Curator47 were sent not from the general server, but directly from a specific IP belonging to her. There could be no mistake. A network glitch, human error, a technical anomaly, all were ruled out. One of the specialists said it succinctly: "She's not a player, she's an operator." After that, the conversation shifted. The investigators began to compare statements. It turned out that a week before Alexei's disappearance, Lilia had deleted almost all her social media accounts, including chats with classmates. But the strangest thing, 3 days before Alexei went missing, she bought a set of old video cameras and a voice recorder from an online marketplace. Payment was made through an anonymous wallet. When this was discovered, it became clear. Nothing that had happened was spontaneous. Someone had prepared the platform in advance, gathered participants, and written the rules. And if the logs were to be believed, Lilia was at the center of this whole structure. Perhaps she hadn't created the room from scratch, but she was the one coordinating the participants' actions and controlling what happened in the real world. Officially, her status was changed that day. From a witness, she became a suspect. The report recorded, "Suspect of organizing a private internet community related to the disappearance of citizen A. Sidorov." But even after that, Lilia did not admit her guilt. She kept repeating the same thing. It was just a game. The investigation understood. Now the story was moving beyond a local tragedy. They needed to find out if Lilia had acted alone or if someone else was behind her. And if the room was really a game, then who had invented the rules? After Lilia's admission, the scope of the investigation widened. The investigators understood one person could not maintain such a system alone. For the room to exist, it needed several participants willing to follow orders, write reports, observe, and verify. So, over the next few weeks, the police began summoning for questioning, one by one, everyone who had interacted with Lilia online. Chat groups, gaming servers, private forums, everything was checked. Gradually, a picture began to form. It turned out that the quiet room had existed for more than a month. It had appeared in the spring, and for a long time looked like a harmless internet community where young people discussed fear tests, challenges that participants devised for each other. At first, they were harmless tasks: walk down an empty corridor at night, record a video in a cemetery, sit in a dark room without light. But over time, the rules became stricter. Each new stage demanded more. And gradually, the participants began to see the room as something more than just a game. The investigation identified 8 other people whose data matched the activity in the logs. 3 of them were from Southport, the rest from neighboring towns. They were all part of the private chat, but communicated with each other only through a system of codes and keywords. No real names were used. Communication was exclusively through encrypted chats and standardized reports. Stage completed, no errors, everything under control. During interrogations, most denied knowing about any dangerous activities. One boy from a neighboring school admitted that he had indeed received tasks from the user Curator47, but he thought it was a joke. According to him, no one took it seriously, until Alexei disappeared. When that happened, many from the group simply left the chat and deleted their accounts. But there was one who gave testimony that changed the course of the case. It was Vladislav R., a quiet, withdrawn boy who for a long time refused to talk, but after several hours confessed. On the night before Alexei's disappearance, Lilia had written to him directly. She asked for his help with the 3rd stage. At the time, he didn't understand what she was talking about, but he remembered a strange detail. She had said, "Don't forget to pass on the silver ruble." This phrase seemed random to the investigators until Vlad clarified that it wasn't a metaphor. According to him, the room had a rule. Whoever passed a trial had to leave behind a sign, an object confirming their participation. Everyone had their own. Lilia's was a bracelet with black beads, Vlad's was an iron key, and Alexei's was an old silver ruble, a coin with the year 1912 stamped on it. Vlad claimed he had seen it. Alexei had shown him a photo in a chat. This ruble became a pivotal detail. Until then, the entire investigation revolved around digital evidence, logs, IP addresses, chats. Now, a physical object appeared that could exist in reality. If Alexei really had the coin, it could be found. And that would be direct proof of the link between the room and his disappearance. The investigators reviewed the protocols from the initial search of the Sidorovs' apartment. The report listed pocket change, phone, flash drive, chain with a pendant. But there was no coin among the evidence. The decision was made to conduct another search. The forensics team returned to the scene. The search was meticulous, inch by inch. They removed baseboards, checked ventilation shafts, and even went through old shoes and boxes of school supplies. And only at the end, at the bottom of a wardrobe, under a layer of dust, they found a small metal case. Inside, the silver ruble, slightly tarnished, but with the year of minting clearly visible. On the lid of the box, they found a fingerprint, not Alexei's. Later, forensics determined it was a match for Lilia Morozova. This became the first piece of physical evidence directly linking her to the disappearance. Now the investigation had not just a digital suspicion, but tangible proof. A fact that couldn't be deleted from a device's memory or erased through a proxy. The found coin became the key to the next stage of the investigation. A second search of Morozova's apartment, and the search for what was hidden behind the legend of the fear tests. After the discovery of the coin, investigators decided to check Lilia's alibi. Until that point, she had claimed that on the night of Alexei's disappearance, she was at home and went to bed around midnight. According to her, she had lost contact with him long before he went offline, and she had nothing to do with it. It all seemed logical, except for one thing. The city's surveillance cameras record almost every step a person takes. They began by checking the route from her house to the bus stop. A camera at a nearby store captured a girl in a black jacket with a hood over her head. The time was 11:41 p.m. The next frame from another street showed her at 12:07 a.m. This was already more than an hour later than she claimed. The girl was walking quickly, alone, heading towards the old park, the very place where Alexei's belongings were later found. During the first interrogation, Lilia had said she didn't leave the house. When she was shown the footage, she visibly tensed. At first, she denied it, then said she might have just gone for a walk. "I was anxious, couldn't sleep," she said. But the recording showed she was walking with purpose, not slowly, not aimlessly, like someone on a sleepless stroll, but quickly, confidently, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Then there was more. A camera at the park entrance recorded her crossing the main path and turning onto a trail leading to the lake. After that, she disappeared from view for almost 40 minutes. Then, at 12:52 a.m., she reappeared on the same camera, but now walking in the opposite direction. Her face looked tired, her steps unsteady, as if returning after a difficult conversation or experience. The investigators requested data from her phone to confirm the route, but the logs showed something strange. The last saved coordinates were recorded at 10:47 p.m., almost an hour before she left the house. After that, complete silence. Not just a lack of signal, but a deliberate disabling of geolocation and deletion of her movement history. Digital security experts conducted an analysis. It turned out that the phone's data had been manually wiped, and not partially, as happens with an accidental clearing, but completely, through a factory reset, performed the very next morning. The system showed the device had been connected to a laptop. A formatting procedure was launched, and then all activity logs were completely deleted. For the investigation, this was a turning point. Until then, they only had circumstantial evidence: chats, the coin, a match in the logs. But now, there was proof of active concealment of data. A person who feels no guilt does not destroy their digital footprint. When Lilia was brought in for questioning again, she was presented with printouts from the street cameras and the expert's report. The investigator said calmly, "Your phone was wiped at 9 in the morning. Can you explain why you did that?" She was silent for a long time. Then she replied, "It just froze, so I reset it. It was always glitching." Her tone was even, but her hands were trembling. The investigator didn't interrupt. He simply placed a photo from the camera in front of her, the frame where she is walking down the path towards the lake. Was this a glitch too? After this scene, the interrogation was suspended. Her status was changed to a person against whom evidence of involvement had been gathered. That same day, a second search was conducted at Lilia's home. The suspect's behavior was becoming increasingly contradictory. One moment, she would confidently state that everything was a coincidence. The next, she would start getting tangled in her answers. First, she denied knowing about the third stage. Then she would recall certain phrases, only to immediately retract her words. Investigators noted a new habit she had developed: avoiding direct eye contact. During interrogations, she would look anywhere but at her questioners. Psychologists observing the process would later say, "This is a typical reaction of someone hiding a specific action but not wanting to lie about its consequences." Everything that had once seemed coincidental now formed a pattern. Contradictions in her testimony, time discrepancies, deleted data, the nighttime walk, it all gradually painted a picture in which Lilia was not a witness, but a key figure. And it was at this stage that the investigation decided to move from analyzing digital evidence to examining physical traces, hoping that the real world had left behind what could not be erased with a single keystroke. A week after the last interrogation, the investigative team returned to where the whole story began. It was the same park, quiet, overgrown, with paths where the lamps had long since burned out. By day, it looked harmless, but at night it turned into a veritable trap of shadows. Now, cars were parked here again. Experts bustled about, setting up equipment. The reason for their return was a report from the canine unit. Based on the scent analysis from Alexei's personal belongings, it was decided to conduct a search with a dog. The investigators knew second chances are rare. The first search had yielded nothing concrete. Back then, they had looked in obvious places, in the thickets near the shore, in old gazebos, along the paths. But if the testimony and the camera route were to be believed, Lilia had gone somewhere further, not along the main path, but along a ravine, towards an overgrown clearing. That's where they sent the dog. The weather was gloomy, damp air, the autumnal smell of earth and wet leaves. The canine handler walked ahead, keeping the leash taut. The dog, a young German shepherd trained for tracking, led with confidence. It moved quickly, as if it knew where to go. The investigators exchanged glances. The movement was too purposeful to be random. Halfway to the clearing, the dog suddenly stopped, growled, and began digging at the base of an old root. At first glance, the spot was unremarkable, but on closer inspection, one could see that the soil here was slightly darker, and the moss was disturbed, as if someone had recently tried to put it back in place. The handler called over an expert, and the work began. Shovels cut into the wet earth. Each strike sounded muffled, as if something heavy lay beneath. A tense silence hung in the air. Everyone knew they were about to find the answer they had been looking for from the very beginning. The minutes dragged on endlessly. Finally, a metal object scraped against the edge of a shovel. They pulled out a black, soaked backpack. It was old, with peeling fabric and a torn zipper. On the strap was a tag with the initials AS. They knew immediately: Alexei. Inside, they found several items: a wearable bracelet, a piece of red ribbon, a small flashlight, and a notebook. Unlike the other items, it was sealed in a plastic bag, as if someone had specifically wanted to protect it from moisture. The investigator carefully took out the notebook and turned to the first page. The handwriting was uneven, as if written on one's lap. Several pages were blank, but then short notes appeared: dates, phrases, single sentences. It was a personal diary. And, as was later established, it belonged not to Alexei, but to Lilia. The diary turned out to be more than just a notebook. It recorded the tasks that the participants of the quiet room received. At the beginning, they were simple, like pass the test, observe him, do as you're told. But towards the end, the entries became more disturbing. One of them was dated the day of the disappearance. He agreed. Stage has begun. There must be a finale, otherwise it's all for nothing. Below this phrase was a strange symbol, resembling a circle with a line through the middle. Experts made copies of all the pages. Further deciphering revealed that the diary was a kind of activity log, where Lilia recorded every step, every conversation. Some lines looked like reminders. Meet at the old tree. Don't be late. Return the coin. All of this matched Vlad's testimony about the silver ruble. At the bottom of the last page was a paragraph that investigators would later call the turning point of the case. The entry read, "He didn't understand what it was all for. Too trusting. It has to be finished before it's too late." After that, a blank space, as if the person hadn't had time to finish the thought. This discovery changed everything. Until that moment, the investigation had numerous clues, but they all required interpretation. Here was her own hand, her handwriting, her confession. Indirect, perhaps, but unambiguous in its meaning. And now the case was no longer just a story about an internet game. It was becoming a story of how a game crossed the line into reality. After examination, the backpack and diary became the central pieces of physical evidence. Experts found soil particles on the cover identical to samples from Lilia's shoes. And at the bottom of a page, in the fingerprints, they found microparticles of a cream that matched the one found in her home. All of this directly linked the found item to the suspect. When Lilia was informed of the discovery, for the first time, she didn't answer. She just sat in silence, staring at a single point. An investigator would later say that at that moment, she had the expression of someone who understood. The story was no longer in her hands. Now the investigation had to not just confirm her involvement, but to find out what was behind this strange finale she wrote about in her diary, and what that symbol, the circle with a line, left under the last entry really meant. After the discovery of the backpack and diary, experts began the most painstaking stage: laboratory analysis. In cases like these, this is the decisive moment. Paper, fabric, microparticles, fingerprints, everything that can shed light on the details is meticulously studied. Sometimes it is precisely such small things that either shatter or confirm an entire theory. The work began with the most obvious: fingerprinting. On the surface of the backpack, they found the prints of 3 people. The first belonged to Alexei, which was expected. It was his bag. The second to Lilia Morozova, a match on all key points, leaving no room for doubt. The third set of prints partially matched Ladislav's, but, as it later turned out, he had indeed handled the backpack when helping Alexei at school. Thus, the 2 main traces remained, those of the victim and the suspect. This was already enough to prove contact between them shortly before the disappearance. Next, they moved on to graphological analysis. Experts compared the handwriting in the diary with samples obtained from Lilia's school notebooks. The analysis took 3 days. The conclusion was delivered without hesitation. The handwriting is identical, with a high degree of probability belonging to the same person. Even the pressure of the pen matched, nervous, with jerks and uneven lines. The graphologist noted that the author was writing under emotional strain, which indicated a state of stress at the time the entries were made. The next step was microtraces. This work required surgical precision. On the inner surface of the bag in which the diary was kept, specialists found microparticles of cream and dust. The analysis revealed the composition: a silicone base with a rare perfume fragrance. The same composition was found on a bottle from Lilia's room. The match was not just probable, it was absolute. This proved that she was the one who had packed the notebook before hiding it. It would seem that after such results, the conclusion was obvious. But the experts went further. They studied the soil clinging to the bottom of the backpack. It was from this moment that the investigation reached a new level. At first glance, it was just dirt, but in forensics, the composition of soil is like a fingerprint.
Each territory has its own unique profile, a combination of minerals, moisture, and plant debris. Under the microscope, the specialists saw that the sample contained rare microparticles of granite, mixed with remnants of construction sand and traces of varnish. This was not typical soil for a park. Such a composition could only be found in one place, near the old garages on the outskirts where repair work was being done. When the experts checked the coordinates, the match was astonishing. Lilia's house was exactly 2 blocks from that site, and the same type of soil was found on her shoes during the search. Thus, a clear, logical chain was formed. The backpack had been in the suspect's house, then was moved to the park and buried. The soil traces showed that the item had traveled between 2 specific points: her home and the hiding place. Moreover, the time of contamination matched the moisture levels of the night of the disappearance. This meant the transfer happened at that exact time. For the investigation, this was crucial. Before, everything was based on circumstantial evidence, testimony, logs, assumptions. Now, they had something that could not be refuted: a physical connection. Not electronic data, not conjecture, but a material trace. The soil, the microparticles, the chemical composition, everything pointed to one thing: the backpack had passed through Lilia's hands and ended up in the ground because of her. When the experts presented their report, the investigator made a brief note in the protocol: factual confirmation of contact and involvement established. This was the moment the story ceased to be a hypothesis. Now, all that remained was to understand the main thing: why. Because the motive hinted at in the last lines of the diary was too convoluted to fit into simple jealousy or a game. And it was this question that the investigation decided to tackle next: to understand what was really hidden behind the word finale, which Lilia so insistently repeated in her entries. After the forensic report was published, the case began to receive widespread public attention. The press was already writing about the girl involved in an online game that ended in tragedy. But Lilia's lawyer, an experienced attorney with 20 years of practice, put forward a new theory. At a press conference, he stated, "My client was not the organizer. She was merely following the instructions of the person behind it all. The participants called him the Shadow." This statement caused a media frenzy. For the first time in the investigation, the suggestion of a third participant emerged, one who allegedly controlled the quiet room from an anonymous profile. According to the defense, Lilia was just a pawn, drawn into a game without understanding the consequences. And the Shadow was the one who wrote the scripts, gave the instructions, and assigned the trials. The investigators could not ignore such a theory. In principle, it seemed plausible. Indeed,
The chats of The Room contained messages from an unknown moderator with the nickname Grey One. The IP address, device, and identity of this user had not been previously established. All activity was routed through VPNs and a chain of proxy servers. The cybercrime unit rejoined the case. A comprehensive digital investigation began, a full trace of Grey One's logs. The task was simple: to determine whether this user existed in reality or was fabricated as a red herring. The first few days of the investigation yielded an unexpected result. On the servers where the Quiet Room's correspondence was stored, they indeed found encrypted messages signed by Grey One. Moreover, the time they were sent coincided with key events: the start of the trials, the assignment of the third stage. It seemed the lawyer was right. The theory of a mastermind suddenly began to look convincing. But soon, the technical analysis revealed something strange. The system noted that the publication time of some of Grey One's messages coincided with the activity of another account, Marina L. In other words, two users were operating from the same device, just in different sessions. The specialists decided to check if it was an error. They reconstructed the authorization chain through the internet provider. The data matched: the same laptop, the same MAC address. The connection was made from the same Wi-Fi router, registered to Lilia Morozova. Moreover, the activity times of both profiles sometimes overlapped within a few seconds, as if a person were simply switching between tabs. When investigators reviewed the correspondence again, it became obvious. The shadow was not some mysterious man from the internet, it was her. Lilia had created a second user to control the other participants and give the game an air of mystery. It was under this name that she wrote the instructions and tasks, as if receiving them from someone higher up. In this way, she controlled the entire process, remaining in the shadows even to those who knew her personally. Psychologists brought into the investigation would later say that such behavior is typical for individuals with control issues. They create the illusion of an external force to justify their own actions. In essence, Grey One was not an accomplice, but a projection. It was a mask behind which Lilia hid herself from guilt. The lawyer tried to insist that the shadow could have been a hacker who gained access to the device. But the forensic analysis completely demolished this line of defense. The laptop's operating system had a profile named Grey One, created on the same day the new user was registered in the Quiet Room. Inside, auto-saved drafts of the same messages that were sent to the chat. Thus, the mastermind turned out to be her own reflection. Not a mystical leader or a manipulator from the internet, but simply another persona she had invented to give the game weight and convince others that their actions were guided not by a person, but by a system. When the results of the analysis were presented in court, the defense had no room to maneuver. The theory of a third party crumbled. On the screen in the courtroom, they displayed screenshots from the laptop, lines of correspondence where the shadow gave orders. The expert's voice declared, "The messages were created by the user Marina L. This fact is confirmed by a digital signature and timestamp." With that, the investigation put an end to the debates about her innocence. Grey One was no longer an unknown. It was her, the person who had invented the game, written the rules, and become its own dictator. After this, the investigation moved into a new phase. Now the task was to understand not who, but why. What had driven her to create the structure and push events to the point of no return? Investigators prepared for a psychological evaluation. hoping it would provide an answer to the question that plagued everyone. What exactly was going on in her head when she decided to become the Shadow? Once the investigation proved that Lilia was behind the Shadow, a new stage began, examining her past. Such cases are never viewed in isolation. If a person creates a structure where others unconditionally obey their commands, it means this scenario has already existed in their life, just on a smaller scale. Investigators turned to the archives to see if an old pattern of behavior was repeating itself. The check began with the databases, a standard procedure. Requests to the school, social services, local police reports. The initial results seemed calm. No offenses, disciplinary actions, or complaints. On the surface, a perfect biography. But when an investigator came across one unresolved incident from 3 years prior, everything changed. The archive mentioned a case of arson in an abandoned warehouse building not far from the old quarry. Officially, the culprit was never found, but Lilia's name appeared in informal reports. At the time, it was written off as an accident. A group of teenagers was spending time near the old workshop, and someone left a candle unextinguished. As a result, the wooden beams caught fire. The fire was put out quickly, no one was hurt, but the incident itself remained. The files noted that she was the initiator of the whole game with candles. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges. All participants denied it was intentional, but according to witnesses, it was Lilia who suggested they test how long wood takes to catch fire if there's wind nearby. Later, one of her acquaintances would say in an interview, "She always knew how to make everyone do what she wanted, without them even realizing it." This incident, at first glance, was no different from typical teenage foolishness. But in the context of the current case, it looked like an ominous precursor. The investigators decided to go further and requested the school's records. They were interested not in academic performance, but in psychological profiles. The school had old records, including reports on student behavior compiled by a school psychologist. It was there that a systemic picture of Lilia's personality first emerged. In a report dated a year before the arson incident, the psychologist noted, "A pronounced tendency to manipulate peers, a need for constant validation of her own significance through control over others, heightened sensitivity to criticism. In stressful situations, aggressive or demonstrative behavior." A separate line read, "Interest in topics of rituals, symbolism, and anonymous interaction. Shows a tendency to construct game systems where she acts as the coordinator." At the time, this just seemed like a character trait, an excessive desire for leadership. No one could have imagined that, in a few years, this tendency would grow into what would later be called a digital theater of submission. The investigators carefully studied the entire document. It contained no mention of aggression in the direct sense, but plenty about a desire for power and control. There, at the bottom of the report, was a recommendation. Observation of behavioral dynamics in a group setting is recommended. Possible signs of compensatory control in situations of emotional stress. This phrase would later be quoted in court as an early warning that no one took seriously. When the psychologist was called for questioning, she confirmed her old observations. According to her, Lilia was not withdrawn, but rather selectively open. She knew how to be friendly, but only when she herself decided who was allowed to get close. And if someone crossed her internal boundaries, she would turn the relationship into a game. The psychologist described it as an emotional model of control through testing. In other words, the person would create a situation to test another. Who would give in? Who would endure? Who would submit? It was becoming clear that her behavior in the quiet room was not spontaneous. It was a logical continuation of a pattern that began back in school. The shadow was not a mask, but a tool, a way to control people while remaining untouchable. This data formed the basis of the psychological evaluation. Psychiatrists, after reviewing the materials, concluded that Lilia's behavior was driven by an obsessive need to control situations and people. The reports submitted to the investigation included phrases like compensatory dependence on domination, destructive modeling of social ties, fixation on managing the behavior of others through structures she creates. In essence, she was creating a world where everything was subject to her rules. And when that world began to crumble, when Alexei tried to leave the game, her internal fear of losing control translated into action. This very motive became the key to understanding the whole story. Not jealousy, not an accident, but the fear of losing power over what she considered her project. After this, the investigation finalized the suspect's psychological profile. She didn't have impulsive outbursts. On the contrary, everything she did was sequential and methodical. She didn't act out of rage. She acted out of the conviction that she had to finish what was started. Now the investigators knew who they were dealing with. This was not just a participant in a game, but a person for whom the quiet room had become a way to control reality. And ahead of them lay the most difficult part, getting a confession from her. The interrogation was scheduled for the morning. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. Not the silence of an empty space, but a dense, tense one, as if the air itself were watching the proceedings. On the table in front of the investigator lay neatly arranged folders, printouts, and photographs. Everything was ready. All that remained was to show her the complete puzzle, where every piece led to a single conclusion. Lilia was brought into the room without handcuffs. She walked calmly, looking a bit tired but composed. She sat down as if she were in a library, not an interrogation room. Upright, hands folded, her gaze fixed on the table. Not a single emotion. The investigator silently turned on the recorder and stated the protocol. From that moment, a game began in which there was no room for improvisation. At first, he said nothing. He simply laid out the photographs in front of her. The backpack, the diary, printouts of the quiet room chats. Then, the handwriting analysis report. He underlined the words, "a complete match." Then, the flash drive containing the activity logs of Gray 1. He placed each piece of evidence separately, as if making a move in a chess game. No loud accusations, no pressure, no threats, just the facts. "All of this has been confirmed," he finally said. "All of this is you." Lilia raised her eyes and looked directly at him, without defiance, without confusion, just silence, as if it no longer mattered. The investigator held the pause. In such cases, silence is a weapon. It stretches, fills the space, and makes the person opposite feel exposed. But she didn't flinch. The minutes ticked by. Not a word. Only the quiet hum of the ventilation and the squeak of a pen on wood as the investigator shifted his position. He understood. Pressure wouldn't work. Her control was rational, not emotional. To break through such a wall, you don't smash it. You pull the ground out from under it. So he changed tactics. "We've found everything except for one thing," he said calmly. "The silver ruble." This phrase worked instantly. Lilia shifted her posture slightly, as if instinctively tensing up. A small, almost imperceptible detail, the movement of her fingers. She clasped her hands a little tighter than before. Her gaze flickered to the side for a second, then returned to the investigator. "What ruble?" Her voice was quiet, but for the first time there was a tremor in it. "The one mentioned in the diary? If he doesn't comply, I'll take the ruble. Those are your words. Where is it?" The silence returned, but now it was different, restless, uneven. She didn't know that detail had been preserved. A flicker of something she hadn't shown before appeared in her eyes, confusion, a small crack in her perfectly constructed defense. The investigator didn't press immediately. He simply unfolded a copy of the diary page with that entry in front of her, and added, "We found soil with the same composition as the soil near your house. We found the backpack with the diary inside. All that's left is to figure out where the rubble is. You know." This pause lasted longer than all the others. Lilia lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled slightly, not from tears, but from tension. The investigator knew the moment had come, and he said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Where is he?" In response, a short breath, then another, and finally her voice, almost soundless. "He was going to leave. He wanted to tell the police everything. I couldn't let that happen. He would have ruined everything." After these words, she fell silent. The investigator didn't interrupt. Let her go on. Let her speak. And she spoke. She explained that a few days before he disappeared, Alexei had indeed decided to leave the quiet room. He realized the game had crossed a line. He said he was going to file a report. For her, it was like a betrayal. She had created the room to control, to prove she could keep everything in check. And he was the only one who could expose her. "He said it was over," she said quietly, "that he wouldn't participate anymore. I went to him, wanted to talk, just to convince him. He wouldn't listen. Then I asked for the ruble back. He didn't understand why, but it was the condition. If he takes back his word, he has to return the symbol. Without that, everything falls apart." She fell silent. The investigator asked where he was now, where the ruble was. "In the same place he is," she answered. "Down there, behind the garages, under the old planks. I buried it deeper so no one would find it." After that, the room became truly quiet. She didn't cry, didn't try to make excuses. She only repeated, "It was supposed to stay between us." The investigator turned off the recorder, made a note in the protocol, and called in the task force. 2 hours later, they were at the location Lilia had indicated, and what they found there confirmed her words completely. This interrogation was the turning point. All the details that had seemed random before now formed a single line. The investigation no longer had any gaps, not in motive, not in actions, not in consequences. All that remained was the final stage, verifying the confession and confirming that Lilia had told the whole truth. The night was raw. A frost had already gripped the ground, and when the investigative team arrived at the indicated location, it seemed as if the air itself was frozen. Behind the garages, between leaning fences and overgrown nettles, was a patch of scorched earth, the one she had described. The place looked ordinary, but there was something wrong with it. The layer of trash was too even, the ground too carefully packed down. People accustomed to such things felt it immediately. The first thing that caught their eye was old planks, arranged like a shield. They were sprinkled with dirt, and on top were broken bricks, as if someone had tried to hide the traces, not in a hurry, but thoroughly. When a sapper lifted the first piece of wood, a smell of dampness and earth rushed out from underneath. They worked quickly, but without unnecessary words. No one asked questions here. Everyone understood what they were looking for, and that the time for talking was long past. The ground was frozen, but beneath the surface, loose. That is always an alarming sign. The shovels slid through layers of clay, pulling out clumps mixed with trash. The minutes dragged on like hours. Each new inch was like a step on a narrow bridge over an abyss. You don't know where the path will end, but you can't turn back. The detectives worked in silence, and only the metallic sound of a shovel broke the quiet. Then, one of them suddenly stopped. The blade had hit something hard. They carefully cleared the area. Fabric emerged from the earth. Not new, but recognizable, dense, with blue stripes on a gray background. It was the backpack, the one Lilia had described. They took it out, carefully placing it on a polyethylene tarp. Inside were the same items mentioned in the interrogation: a lighter, a metal pendant, scraps of paper, and, at the very bottom, a round object covered in dirt: the silver ruble. This find was the final piece. Now everything came together: the confession, the diary, the location, and the object around which the whole story had revolved. The investigator standing nearby simply nodded to the expert, without words, without emotion. The deed had spoken for itself. When the ruble was handed over to the criminologists, the chain of verification began. On its surface were micro traces of blood and the print of a thumb. And that print matched the database, Alexei's. There could be no mistake. Later, in the forensic medical report, it would be dryly recorded: cause of death, head trauma inflicted by a blunt object. Time of death, consistent with the night of disappearance. Everything matched down to the minute. This statement sounded like a cold verdict, not because it revealed anything new. By that point, everyone knew where the case was heading, but because it closed the last loophole for doubt. There were no more ifs or maybes. The scene at the wasteland became a kind of finale to the long story, the moment when the investigation, as if coming full circle, returned to the very beginning. From the first lost phone signal to the shovel striking the frozen ground, everything formed a chain that could no longer be broken. When the equipment was turned off and the floodlights went dark, silence once again enveloped the place. Only on the tarp, next to the backpack, a cleaned silver ruble gleamed dimly. A small but decisive symbol that finally gave the investigation what they had been seeking for many months: irrefutable proof. It was from this moment that the case officially entered its final phase. A reconstruction of events was to be conducted, and charges were to be filed from which there would be no escape. After the investigative team confirmed Lilia's words and the experts finalized their report, the moment everyone involved in the case had been waiting for arrived. The moment of official confession. Not an emotional or intuitive one, but a documented one, with a signature and a seal. It was a threshold, after which the story ceased to be a mystery and became a legal fact. The same room was chosen for the procedure: quiet, isolated, without extraneous sounds or people. On the table in front of Lilia lay a clean sheet of paper, a pen, and the folder with her case file. Everything looked simple, but the atmosphere in the room was almost palpably dense. Every breath, every sigh seemed louder than it should be. The investigator sat opposite her, turned on the recorder, recited the legal formalities, and said, "Lilia, are you prepared to state everything in your own words, in writing, without coercion, in the presence of witnesses?" She nodded. No emotion, no tears, no desperate look, no attempts to justify herself. Only fatigue and a kind of internal resignation. As if she had long known this moment would come, she was just waiting for when. The first words were difficult for her. The pen seemed to stick with every movement. The handwriting was neat and steady, but trembled slightly in places. The lines came slowly, with long pauses between sentences. She didn't write in a stream. She constructed each word like a brick in a wall, trying to make nothing seem superfluous. At times, she would stop, raise her eyes, and just stare at the wall. In these brief pauses, there was something strange, as if she were mentally retracing the path, step by step, returning to that evening. The investigator didn't rush her. On the contrary, he gave her as much time as she needed. What was important to him was not just a confession, but one that came from her, without pressure, without prompting. When she finished, she carefully placed the pen down, reread what she had written, and added a note at the bottom of the page. "I wrote this voluntarily. No one forced me. Everything stated is the truth." The signature was clear, like that of someone accustomed to maintaining control even in small details. Not a trace of hesitation, not a single corrected letter. Then the investigator asked her to tell the story orally. Not read, but live, without the paper. She was silent for a long time. The silence in the room grew thicker until she finally spoke. Her voice was hollow, almost without intonation. "We met in the evening. He said he was going to the police the next day. I begged him not to. He said it was over, that he didn't want to play anymore. We argued. He turned to leave. I grabbed his arm. He pulled away. I pushed him. Not hard. I just wanted him to stop. He slipped. He fell on the rocks. It all happened in a second. I panicked. I didn't know what to do." She spoke slowly, as if recalling every movement. And yet it was too smooth, too polished. It was noticeable even in her tone. This wasn't the story of an accident, but a carefully crafted version. Perhaps she truly believed it would help save her. Perhaps she just wanted something to sound softer than the truth. The investigator listened without interrupting. Everything he needed was already in the file. The diary, the digital logs, the traces on the backpack, the fingerprints, the rubble. Her words changed nothing, but they held immense significance for the court. Now a motive could be established. A personal conflict, fear of exposure, loss of control. After her account, she lowered her eyes, rubbed her temples, and quietly added, "I didn't want it to end like this. Everything got out of control." This phrase became key for her lawyer. It would later be turned into the defense's argument. It all happened by accident, without intent. They would build a case where Lilia was not a cold-blooded manipulator, but a person driven to desperation who had lost her self-control. But the prosecution had a different picture. All of her correspondence, the entire structure of the quiet room, it was a system of power, not an impulse. Every action she took was built around one idea: keeping others under control. And when that control crumbled, everything else crumbled with it. Therefore, the lawyers understood. In court, the question would not be whether she did it, but why and how. Accident or intent, an unintentional push or a conscious act. Lilia's confession was officially added to the case file. On the next page, the investigator noted, "Testimony obtained voluntarily, without coercion. Signature present." After that, the final preparations began, transferring the case to the prosecutor's office and formulating the indictment. As she was being led out of the room, Lilia stopped at the door. She turned for a second, looked at the stack of papers on the table, her life condensed into a single volume, and said quietly, "No one will ever understand why I did it anyway." Those were her last words before the door closed behind her. The investigation concluded. Next came the trial, the public, transcripts, experts, psychiatrists. The story that began as a mysterious disappearance had now become a case where every document, every phrase, every pause carried legal weight, and where the final question was no longer who was guilty, but how much guilt could be proven. The crime scene reconstruction was scheduled after all key forensic examinations were completed, officially to verify the suspect's testimony, unofficially to ensure her story aligned with physical reality and wasn't fabricated on the spot. Even the most logical confessions can sometimes fall apart when a person is back at the scene of the events. The team went out early in the morning. A cold fog hung over the wasteland, the grass crunching underfoot with frost. All around were the same garages, leaning fences, trash, and brick fragments as before. But now, at the place where it all began, stood cameras, experts, investigators, and witnesses. The space where an impulsive conflict once occurred had been transformed into a stage where every detail had to be reconstructed with maximum precision. Lilia was brought in under guard. She wore a gray puffer jacket, gloves on her hands, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked detached, but complied with instructions without resistance. The investigator asked the first question. "Show us exactly where it happened." She looked around for a moment, as if trying to match the location with her memories. Then she slowly walked to the edge of the ravine, where the soil was already disturbed from previous work. She stopped, looked down, and pointed slightly to the right. "Here." He was standing right here, with his back to me. I approached from here. There were about 2 steps between us. An expert marked the coordinates. At that moment, no one spoke. Even the cameras seemed to be recording silence. An officer noted her position on a diagram and asked her to repeat the movement, without physical contact, just to show how it was. Lilia obediently reenacted a step forward, a light push with her hand. The scenario looked convincing. Everything matched in terms of distance, direction, and height. But the investigators were interested in something else, details that couldn't be invented. They asked, "After he fell, what did you do?" "At first, I just stood there. Then I went closer. He wasn't moving. I got scared. Then I went home." That last phrase was spoken quietly, but very clearly. To confirm or refute her words, the criminologists began a second inspection of the site. The task was to find the specific rock she mentioned during the interrogation. According to her, Alexei had fallen right on it. To the naked eye, everything around looked the same: dozens of boulders, gravel, trash. But the specialists knew what to look for. And 20 minutes later, one of the experts called the others over. Under a layer of earth, about 1.5 meters from the spot she had indicated, they found a large, flat rock with a distinctive mark. Brown stains were visible on it, partially covered by dirt and moss. At first glance, it was unremarkable, but the experts knew immediately. This required laboratory confirmation. The rock was carefully extracted, packaged, and sent for analysis. While the report was being drawn up, Lilia stood motionless, without saying a word. She didn't look at the find, didn't avert her gaze, just stood there, as if disconnected from what was happening. The investigator watched her closely, trying to catch the slightest reaction, but saw nothing. No surprise, no fear, as if everything that was happening was already known to her in advance. A few days later, the results of the analysis came back. The traces on the rock were biological. The examination confirmed it was Alexi's blood. A complete match, including the DNA profile. Additionally, microparticles of clothing fabric were found, corresponding to those discovered at the site where the backpack was found. The expert's conclusion removed the last doubts. Lilia's version of a push and a fall did indeed match the physical data. The mechanism of injury was fully confirmed. But, as the investigator noted in his report, this fact did not excuse her actions, but merely clarified the circumstances. After all, an accident is one thing, but concealing evidence and trying to pass off a deliberate act is another. After this, the crime scene reconstruction was officially declared a success. All materials, the video recording, the protocol, the photographic evidence, and the forensic report, formed the basis of the indictment. It was from this moment that the case ceased to be an investigation in the classic sense. The story that began with the search for a missing person had now turned into a legal proceeding. Ahead lay the final, most public part, the trial, where every fact, every piece of evidence, and every word would once again be tested for truth. The court hearing began 8 months after the investigation concluded. During that time, the case had grown to dozens of volumes, filled with expert reports, testimonies, and analyses. Everything that had once been a private tragedy was now a matter of public scrutiny. In the courtroom were cameras, journalists, acquaintances, and curious onlookers. And at the center of this stage was Lilia. Calm, neatly dressed, reserved. She didn't look lost, but there was no confidence in her either, more like an emptiness. The prosecutor began his opening statement first. His speech was measured, without theatrical inflections. He reminded the court of the timeline of events, emphasized the motive, fear of exposure, the desire to maintain control, and highlighted the sequence of her actions after the tragedy, concealing evidence, deleting correspondence, disappearing from the network. All of this, in the prosecution's view, pointed not to an accident, but to cold-blooded calculation. The defense attorney, in contrast, built his case on emotional contrast. He spoke of a nervous breakdown, of the pressure of circumstances, of personal conflicts that had spun out of control. He stressed that the incident itself was not premeditated, that Lilia had not planned, not prepared, not intended for this to happen, but had simply lost control of herself. His words sounded softer, more human, but they lacked a foundation in facts. When the witnesses were called into the courtroom, the atmosphere tangibly changed. Kirill, a participant in that same quiet room, was the first to speak. He spoke quietly, not looking in Lilia's direction. He recounted how Marina, her username in the chat, always acted like a leader, manipulating and guiding others, skillfully pushing them into action. And although their games seemed harmless, she was the one who determined who would stay and who would be expelled. Then Alina, another participant, testified. She said that a week before Alexi's disappearance, Lilia had written to her in a private message, "He's going to ruin everything. I won't let that happen." The judge asked for the screenshots to be read aloud, and those lines echoed in the courtroom with a particular weight. After that, the defense's arguments seemed increasingly weak. At one point, the prosecutor requested that the psychological evaluation report be read. It contained the familiar words from the investigation: heightened need for control, emotional coldness, compensatory drive for power. These phrases sounded like a sentence even before the judge picked up the final document. And then, after a hearing that lasted for hours, the judge offered Lilia the right to a final statement. This was her chance, a single moment to say something human, remorse, an explanation, at least one word that would leave a seed of doubt. She stood up, looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then out at the courtroom. She was silent. A few seconds passed, and it became clear she was not going to speak. The judge repeated the question. She shook her head and said quietly, "No." At that moment, the courtroom fell into a near-deafening silence. Her silence was louder than any speech. It became the final brushstroke in her portrait, closed, cold, impenetrable, as if everything she could say had already been said to the investigation long ago. The court adjourned to the deliberation room. The half-hour wait felt like an eternity. Then the door opened. The judge returned, sat down, arranged his papers, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. Everything was strictly by procedure. Established, proven, confirmed. The court took her confession into account, but noted the concealment of evidence, the false testimony in the early stages, and the lack of remorse. These points became aggravating factors. The defendant is found guilty under Article 111, Part 4, the judge pronounced, sentenced to 9 years of imprisonment in a general regime correctional colony. No one in the courtroom moved. She stood calmly, listening without blinking. When the judge finished, the guards approached and motioned for her to go. Lilia turned, her gaze lingering on the courtroom for a moment, without fear, without regret, just a look into the void, and walked toward the exit. Thus ended the judicial phase. The story of The Quiet Room received its legal conclusion. But even with the verdict, shadows remained. Unsolved motives, cold pauses. Lilia's strange certainty that everything that had happened was merely a continuation of her game. And perhaps that was the most disturbing thing about this whole story. Even in defeat, she seemed to still be playing the role she had created for herself. After the trial, the city seemed to fall silent for a time. The long months of discussions, speculations, and investigations all ended in a single moment. But the quiet that followed brought no relief. It was thick, unsettling, as if something had been left unsaid in the air. For a long time, people avoided mentioning Lilia's and Alexia's names aloud, as if fearing that to speak them would bring the story back to life. Those who had been part of The Quiet Room tried to return to normal life. Kirill moved to another city, enrolled in college, and completely changed his social circle. He gave one single interview, in which he said briefly, "I just wanted to forget. It was all stupid, but now it's too late." After that, he vanished from the public eye. Alina, on the other hand, stayed in the city. She avoided journalists for a long time, but a year later, she appeared on a forum dedicated to online psychological safety. There, for the first time, she revealed that the game had not been just for fun. It was a system of pressure disguised as friendship, where Lilia skillfully manipulated the emotions of others. For the investigation, these people were witnesses, but for society, they were a reminder. Their names were now mentioned not as chat participants, but as a living warning. They were no longer perceived as figures in someone else's story. Each of them became part of what psychologists would later call the phenomenon of online influence spirals, when virtual relationships gradually supplant reality, replacing genuine connections with the illusion of intimacy. The city held several meetings with educators, psychologists, and IT specialists. At these gatherings, they discussed how to avoid similar situations, how to spot when someone has fallen under an influence in time. School notice boards displayed hotline numbers, and the local government commissioned a series of lectures on digital addiction and psychological manipulation on the Internet. Local media dedicated a whole series of reports to the story. At first, they were sensational with loud headlines. Later, they became more thoughtful. Gradually, the tone of the publications shifted from shock to analysis. Newspapers began writing not about the scandal, but about its causes. Why this story was even possible. Why no one noticed how things escalated to tragedy. In universities, sociologists use Lilia's case as an example in lectures on cyberpsychology. Lawyers referenced it when discussing amendments to laws on digital communication. For the first time, a court had recognized that virtual activity is not just communication, but a space where real influence can be formed, with all its consequences. 2 years after the verdict, the region adopted a local program for the prevention of digital risks for teenagers. Its foundation was based on the findings of the investigation. It included points on monitoring anonymous communities, on the work of school psychologists with online groups, and on mandatory media literacy courses. Alexei's family declined interviews, but agreed to the creation of a memorial fund in his name. The fund engaged in educational projects, helping those who faced internet addiction and psychological pressure online. At first, it was a small volunteer association, but then specialists from Moscow and St. Petersburg joined. Gradually, the case that began as a private drama became a focal point around which a new understanding was built, that evil can now exist not only on the streets, but also in chats, in anonymous dialogues, in seemingly harmless conversations, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who know how to be convincing behind a screen. Lilia is serving her sentence in a colony. According to official reports, she behaves calmly and does not violate the rules. She sometimes writes letters. In one of them, according to her lawyer, she wrote just one sentence: "I just wanted everything to be my way." And so ended the case that began with a disappearance and turned into a large-scale investigation that changed an entire system. The investigation is over. The trial has taken place. The file is closed. But the residue of this story lives on to this day. Because it wasn't just a crime. It was a mirror. And anyone who has ever looked into it could no longer see themselves as they were before.